A calm evening in a prestigious restaurant takes a shocking turn when a group of racist police officers attempts to humiliate a respected black judge. The tension escalates as these officers misuse their authority to impose their bias, assuming their target is powerless. Little do they know their actions are about to unravel their very careers. What begins as a scene of blatant discrimination transforms into an unforgettable display of justice and accountability as the judge takes a stand that no one could have predicted. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. The calm before the storm. The restaurant buzzed with quiet elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light across white tablecloths, and the murmur of conversations blended seamlessly with the notes of a classical piano. Judge Malcolm Harris adjusted his tie and settled into his seat near the large bay window, savoring the brief respite from the chaos of his courtroom. This restaurant had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could sit alone and think. Tonight was no different. Malcolm had just returned from a long day of presiding over a contentious trial, and the quiet ambience of this space was a welcome contrast to the heated arguments he had left behind. "Good evening, sir," the waiter greeted, placing a leather-bound menu in front of him. "Can I get you started with anything to drink?" "Just water for now, thank you," Malcolm replied, offering a polite smile. As the waiter stepped away, the sound of the restaurant doors swinging open briefly disrupted the tranquil atmosphere. Two uniformed police officers strode in, their voices louder than necessary. "Man, look at this place," said the taller officer, Sergeant Ray Carter. "Fancy crowd tonight." His partner, Officer Greg Mitchell, chuckled. "Yeah, must be nice to have money to burn." Their eyes scanned the room, finally landing on Malcolm. Carter's smirk widened as he nudged Mitchell. "Check it out," he whispered, his voice carrying just enough to ensure Malcolm could hear. "Guess they're letting anyone in these days." Malcolm's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his gaze fixed on the menu in front of him. Years of experience had taught him that the best response to provocation was often no response at all. The officers were seated a few tables away, but their presence loomed large. Carter's voice, purposefully loud, cut through the quiet ambience. "Place like this should have some standards," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Wouldn't want the wrong kind of people bringing it down." Malcolm's eyes flicked up briefly, his sharp gaze meeting Carter's. It was a calculated look, not confrontational but not submissive either. He returned his attention to his menu, refusing to be drawn in. A server approached their table to take their order, but Carter waved him off. "Not yet, we're just getting a feel for the place," he said, loud enough to draw glances from nearby diners. As the moment stretched on, it became clear that the officers weren't here to simply enjoy a meal. Their eyes kept darting toward Malcolm, their whispers and stifled laughter making no effort to hide their contempt. Finally, Carter leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying across the room. "Hey, waiter!" he called out, motioning to Malcolm's table. The waiter, visibly flustered, approached. "Yes, sir?" Carter gestured toward Malcolm. "That guy over there. He looks familiar. You sure he didn't just sneak in?" The room fell silent. Conversations halted as diners turned their attention toward the scene unfolding. Malcolm set his menu down slowly, his calm demeanor masking the simmering anger beneath the surface. "Excuse me," Malcolm asked, his voice measured but firm. Carter smirked. "Just making sure everything's in order. You know how it is." The waiter stammered. Mr. Harris is a regular here, sir." "A regular, huh?" Mitchell chimed in, leaning forward with a mocking grin. "Well, that's nice. Just wanted to make sure the rules apply to everyone." Malcolm's gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Gentlemen, is there something you need from me? Or are you simply looking to entertain yourselves at my expense?" Carter leaned forward, his expression one of mock innocence. "Oh, no trouble at all. Just doing our duty, Judge Harris. Gotta keep things in line, you know." The emphasis on the word judge wasn't lost on Malcolm. He held Carter's gaze, unflinching. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain how harassing patrons in a private establishment falls under your duty." The tension in the room was palpable. Diners exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The waiter stepped back, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the officers. Carter chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Relax, Judge. We're just having a little fun." Malcolm straightened his posture, exuding the quiet authority that had commanded respect in countless courtrooms. "I suggest you find your amusement elsewhere, and quickly." The officers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering ever so slightly. But before the situation could escalate further, the restaurant manager appeared, his face flushed with anxiety. "Gentlemen," the manager began, his voice trembling, "is there a problem here?" "No problem at all," Carter replied smoothly, standing up and adjusting his belt. "We were just leaving." But Malcolm knew this wasn't over. The subtle threat in Carter's tone and the lingering glances the officers cast as they exited the restaurant spoke volumes. As the manager apologized profusely and offered to comp Malcolm's meal, the judge waved him off. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The night had taken an unexpected turn, but Malcolm wasn't one to back down. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't the last he'd see of those officers. And the next time they crossed paths, things would be different. A line drawn in the sand. The following morning, the sun broke over the city, casting long shadows on the courthouse steps. Judge Malcolm Harris stood in his chambers, his back to the large window as he gazed at the cityscape. His mind replayed the events of the previous night, the smug arrogance of Sergeant Carter, the palpable tension in the restaurant, and the simmering anger he'd worked so hard to contain. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, turning to see his assistant, Grace, step into the room. "Good morning, Judge," she greeted, her usual cheerful demeanor tinged with concern. "I have the docket for today's cases." "Thank you, Grace," Malcolm replied, taking the file. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "Is everything all right? You seem distracted?" Malcolm offered a faint smile. "Just a long night, that's all." Grace nodded, but her expression betrayed her skepticism. She had worked with Malcolm long enough to know when something was bothering him. As she left the room, Malcolm sat at his desk flipping through the docket. His day was packed with hearings and rulings, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Carter and Mitchell. Their words, their behavior, it wasn't just a personal slight. It was a symptom of something deeper, something systemic. Later that day, Malcolm's courtroom was a flurry of activity. Lawyers presented their arguments, witnesses took the stand, and Malcolm presided with his usual composure. But as the last case wrapped up and the room cleared, he felt a lingering unease. He returned to his chambers, intent on focusing on his work, but the knock at his door interrupted him again. This time, it was a colleague, Judge Cynthia Morales, her expression unreadable. "Malcolm," she began, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I heard about what happened at La Maison last night." Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly. "Word travels fast. You know how this city works," Cynthia replied with a faint smirk. "A prominent judge getting harassed by two cops? It's already making the rounds." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on his desk. "And what's the general consensus?" "Depends on who you ask," Cynthia said, crossing her arms. "Some people think you should let it go. Others think you should file a formal complaint." "And you?" Cynthia hesitated before replying, "I think you need to be careful. Those officers didn't target you randomly. They knew who you were." "That's exactly why I can't let this slide," Malcolm said, his tone firm. Cynthia sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "I get it, but you know how these things go. Even with your position, you'll face pushback." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I've dealt with pushback my entire career. That doesn't mean I back down." Their conversation was interrupted by Grace poking her head into the room. "Judge Harris, there's someone here to see you. He didn't have an appointment, but he said it's urgent." "Who is it?" Malcolm asked. Grace hesitated. "Sergeant Ray Carter." Malcolm's expression darkened as Carter strode into his chambers moments later, his usual smug demeanor firmly in place. He removed his hat and glanced around the room before settling his gaze on Malcolm. "Judge Harris," Carter began, his tone syrupy and insincere. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Malcolm replied bluntly. "What do you want, Sergeant?" Carter's smirk widened. "I wanted to apologize for any misunderstanding last night. You know how these things can get blown out of proportion." "Is that so?" Malcolm asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Of course," Carter continued, ignoring the cold reception. "We wouldn't want any bad blood, especially not between a respected judge and the police department." Malcolm stood, his imposing presence making the room feel smaller. "Let me make something clear, Sergeant. What happened last night wasn't a misunderstanding. It was blatant harassment. And if you think showing up here with some half-hearted apology will make me forget it, you're mistaken." Carter's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "With all due respect, Judge, I was just trying to smooth things over. No need to make this a bigger deal than it is." "It is a big deal," Malcolm shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You targeted me because you thought you could get away with it, and I have no doubt I'm not the first person you've treated this way." The tension in the room was palpable as the two men locked eyes. Finally, Carter stepped back, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, Judge, if you feel that strongly, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." "That's a promise," Malcolm replied coldly. Carter tipped his hat and exited the chambers, leaving Malcolm standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. That evening, Malcolm sat in his study, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He knew the path he was about to take would be fraught with challenges, but he couldn't stand by and let people like Carter wield their authority unchecked. He picked up his phone and began dialing, his resolve hardening with each passing second. The fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, intimidated, or humiliated by those who abused their power. As the phone rang on the other end, Malcolm's mind was clear. The line had been drawn, and there was no turning back. A plan set in motion. The sound of a steady rain pattered against the windows of Malcolm's study as he leaned back in his chair, phone pressed to his ear. The person on the other end answered on the third ring, their voice professional but curious. "This is Alicia Harper," the voice said. "Alicia, it's Judge Malcolm Harris," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. There was a pause before Alicia responded, "Judge Harris, this is a surprise. What can I do for you?" "I need your help," Malcolm said, cutting straight to the point. "I'm sure you've heard about what happened last night at La Maison." "I have," Alicia replied cautiously. "It's already making waves. The details are murky, though. I want to make sure those details become crystal clear," Malcolm said, "and I need someone who knows how to dig deep, someone who can make this more than just another incident that gets swept under the rug." Alicia's tone sharpened. "Are you asking me to investigate?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "This isn't just about me. It's about a culture of abuse and impunity. I want to expose it." Alicia was silent for a moment, then said, "If I take this on, you need to understand what you're asking for. This will ruffle feathers, Malcolm. Powerful ones." "I know," Malcolm replied, "and I'm prepared for it." "All right," Alicia said, her voice resolute. "Let's start with the facts. Tell me everything that happened." The following day, Alicia Harper sat across from Malcolm in his study, her laptop open and a notepad beside her. Malcolm recounted the events of the night with precision, sparing no detail. When he finished, Alicia leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her notepad. "This isn't just about two cops flexing their power," she said. "It's systemic. If they felt comfortable enough to harass you, a judge in public, imagine what they do to people without your resources or influence." "Exactly," Malcolm said. "That's why this can't stop with me. These officers, and the culture that enables them, need to be held accountable." Alicia nodded. "I'll start digging into Carter and Mitchell's records. Complaints, disciplinary actions, body cam footage, whatever I can find. And I'll reach out to some allies in the legal community," Malcolm added. "This isn't a fight I can win alone." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit precinct office, Sergeant Carter sat across from Officer Mitchell, his expression tight with frustration. "Oh, you went to his chambers?" Mitchell asked, his voice low. "Are you out of your mind?" "I was trying to neutralize the situation," Carter snapped. "Well, how'd that work out for you?" Mitchell shot back. Carter's jaw tightened. "He's not going to let it go," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean we roll over. We've dealt with people like him before." Mitchell frowned. "He's not like the others, Ray. He's a judge. That puts a target on us if he decides to escalate." Carter leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. Over the next week, Alicia uncovered a disturbing pattern. Using her network of contacts, she pieced together a timeline of Carter and Mitchell's misconduct. Multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling and harassment painted a damning picture. Alicia met with Malcolm again to share her findings. "These two have been protected for years," she said, sliding a file across the desk. "Complaints dismissed, investigations stalled, witnesses intimidated." Malcolm flipped through the pages, his expression grim. "And yet, they still wear the badge." "Because the system shields them," Alicia said, "and dismantling that shield isn't easy." Malcolm nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we start by showing the world who they really are." The first step in their plan was to make the story public. Alicia contacted a trusted journalist at a major news outlet, providing them with the evidence she had gathered. The journalist agreed to run an exposé, highlighting not only the incident at La Maison, but also the broader pattern of abuse by Carter and Mitchell. When the story broke, it sent shockwaves through the city. Headlines blared, "Respected judge harassed by police, a culture of abuse exposed." Social media erupted with outrage. Videos of Malcolm's confrontation with Carter at the restaurant, captured by other diners, went viral. The public demanded answers, and the pressure on the police department mounted. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Daniels called an emergency meeting, his face grim as he addressed the room. "This department is under fire," he began, his voice sharp. "We've got protesters outside, reporters digging into our files, and two of our officers at the center of a media storm." Carter sat in the back, his expression unreadable. Mitchell glanced nervously at him, then back at the chief. "I've initiated an internal review," Daniels continued. "But make no mistake, if this escalates, heads will roll." That evening, Malcolm stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by community leaders and activists. Microphones and cameras surrounded him as he prepared to speak. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about a system that allows those with power to abuse it without consequence. That ends now." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for all. Accountability now." Malcolm knew the fight was just beginning, but as he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes are raised. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Malcolm's study, casting long shadows across the room. Alicia sat across from him, reviewing the latest updates on her laptop. Her face was set in a determined frown. "Last night's protests made the evening news," she said, not looking up from the screen. "The department released a vague statement about their commitment to transparency, but it's all smoke and mirrors." Malcolm leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "And Carter and Mitchell?" Alicia shook her head. "Still on active duty. No suspension, no accountability." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Then it's time to turn up the pressure." That afternoon, Malcolm convened a meeting with key allies, activists, legal experts, and local leaders. The room buzzed with energy as ideas and strategies were exchanged. "We need to keep the momentum going," Malcolm said, addressing the group. "Public pressure is our greatest weapon right now, but we also need to work behind the scenes to ensure this doesn't lose steam." Alicia stood, holding up a file. "I've compiled a list of cases tied to Carter and Mitchell. Every complaint, every questionable arrest. These are the voices that have been silenced. It's time to amplify them." The room erupted in agreement. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, the tension was palpable. Carter paced the small break room, his face a mask of frustration. Mitchell sat at the table, nervously tapping his fingers. "You see the news?" Mitchell asked. "Of course I did," Carter snapped. "It's everywhere. That judge is making us out to be villains." "Maybe because we were out of line," Mitchell ventured cautiously. Carter shot him a glare. "Don't start with that. You know as well as I do that this is about control. They want to take it from us, and I'm not letting that happen." Mitchell swallowed hard but said nothing. As the days passed, the protests grew larger, drawing support from neighboring communities and even national advocacy groups. Signs reading "Justice for Judge Harris" and "End Police Corruption" filled the streets. One evening, Malcolm addressed the crowd from a makeshift podium. His voice was clear and strong, cutting through the chants and cheers. "This isn't just about one night or two officers," he said. "It's about a culture that prioritizes power over justice. We cannot stand by while the very people sworn to protect us abuse their authority." The crowd roared in response, their collective energy palpable. Inside his office, Chief Daniels watched the live broadcast with a grim expression. His assistant knocked hesitantly before entering. "Sir, the mayor's office called," she said. "They're demanding updates on the internal review." Daniels sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What do they expect me to say? That we've been protecting these guys for years and now it's finally catching up to us?" The assistant hesitated before replying. "The mayor wants this handled quietly, but the public won't let it go. We're losing control of the narrative." Daniels nodded slowly. "Then it's time to shift the narrative." The next morning, a breaking news report dominated the airwaves. Anonymous source leaks body cam footage of judges' confrontation. The footage was damning. Carter and Mitchell's behavior, condescension, veiled threats, and outright harassment, was on full display. The video quickly went viral, sparking widespread outrage. Malcolm watched the footage in silence, his expression unreadable. When it ended, he turned to Alicia. "This changes everything," he said. Alicia nodded. "It does, but it also puts a target on your back." Carter and Mitchell sat in a dimly lit conference room at the precinct, facing Chief Daniels. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "This footage is a disaster," Daniels said, his voice low and angry. "Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts the department in?" Carter leaned back in his chair, his smirk defiant. "It's not like I leaked it." "That's not the point," Daniels snapped. "The point is that the public is demanding action and we're out of options." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "What are you saying, Chief?" Daniels' gaze hardened. "I'm saying you're both being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Carter's smirk vanished. "You're throwing us under the bus?" "I'm protecting this department," Daniels replied. "If you'd done your jobs properly, we wouldn't be in this mess." Outside the courthouse, Malcolm addressed a throng of reporters. The leaked footage had intensified media scrutiny, and questions flew at him from every direction. "Judge Harris, what do you hope to achieve by pursuing this so publicly?" "I want justice," Malcolm said firmly. "Not just for myself, but for every person who has suffered at the hands of a broken system. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability." Another reporter asked, "What do you say to critics who claim you're using your position to further your own agenda?" Malcolm's gaze was steady. "My agenda is justice. And if standing up for what's right makes some people uncomfortable, so be it." That evening, Malcolm returned home to find a letter waiting for him on his doorstep. The envelope was unmarked, but its contents were chilling. A photograph of his family with the words "back off" scrawled across it in red ink. He stared at the photo for a long moment, his hand tightening into a fist. Then he reached for his phone. "We need to meet," he said, when Alicia answered. "Unyielding resolve." Malcolm sat at the head of his dining room table, the photograph spread out before him. Alicia stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, her face etched with concern. "This is a direct threat," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can't ignore this." "I don't plan to," Malcolm replied, "but I also won't be intimidated. This isn't just about me, it's about exposing the truth." Alicia nodded. "Then we need to strategize carefully. Whoever sent this knows they're losing control." The next day, Malcolm met with a trusted friend, Detective Jordan Reed, in a secluded cafe. Reed had built a reputation for integrity, a rare quality in the force. Reed examined the photo, his expression grim. "This is serious, Malcolm. Whoever sent this knows how to send a message without leaving fingerprints." "I need you to find out who's behind it," Malcolm said, quietly. Reed nodded. "I'll do what I can. But you need to be careful. These kinds of threats escalate." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I can handle myself, just get me answers." Meanwhile, Carter and Mitchell sat in their respective homes, watching the fallout unfold on the news. Mitchell's phone buzzed with texts from colleagues, some offering support, others cutting ties. Carter, on the other hand, was livid. He paced his living room, muttering under his breath. "They're making us scapegoats," he growled, slamming his fist on the counter. "All because that judge won't back down." Mitchell hesitated before replying. "Maybe we should just let it go, Carter. The footage, it's bad." Carter turned on him, his eyes blazing. "Let it go. They're ruining us. If we go down, we take them with us." Mitchell's unease deepened, but he said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Carter when he was like this. Back at the courthouse, Malcolm filed a formal complaint against Carter and Mitchell, accompanied by the footage and additional evidence gathered by Alicia. The legal community buzzed with whispers of his bold move. "That's a dangerous play," one colleague remarked. "You're poking a hornet's nest." "I'm seeking justice," Malcolm replied firmly. "If that stirs the hornets, so be it." The protests outside the precinct grew more fervent, drawing national attention. Community leaders joined the cause, amplifying Malcolm's message. Among them was Reverend Elijah Bennett, a charismatic orator known for his work in civil rights. Bennett stood beside Malcolm at a rally, his booming voice energizing the crowd. "This fight is bigger than one man or one case. This is about dismantling a system built on fear and prejudice." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside the precinct, Chief Daniels watched the rally on a muted television. His assistant entered, her expression tense. "Chief, we've received more complaints about Carter and Mitchell," she said. "People are coming forward now that the footage is out." Daniels sighed heavily. "How bad is it?" "It's a pattern," she replied. "Racial profiling, excessive force, falsified reports. If this keeps up, we're looking at a full-blown investigation." Daniels rubbed his temples. "We need to contain this before it spreads." That night, Malcolm attended a community meeting at a local church. The room was packed, the air thick with tension and determination. As he spoke about his vision for systemic reform, a young man in the back stood up. "Judge Harris, what makes you think this will change anything? The system's been broken for decades." Malcolm paused, his gaze steady. "Because change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people like us refuse to accept the status quo. This fight is worth it, not just for us but for the generations to come." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. As the meeting concluded, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was Reed. "I've got something," Reed said. "The photo, it was sent from a burner phone, but I traced a purchase that matches the timeline. It's linked to a known associate of Carter." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you have a name?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Reed replied. "Be careful, Malcolm. Whoever did this isn't bluffing." Closing in on the truth, Malcolm paced his study late into the night, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The threats against him were intensifying, but they only fueled his determination. Alicia, sitting across from him, reviewed the latest findings from Detective Reed. "This ties Carter to the burner phone," she said, tapping on a printed document. "But it's not enough. We need something irrefutable." Malcolm nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We're getting close. Carter's arrogance will be his undoing." The next morning, Alicia reached out to a contact in local media, a sharp journalist named Serena Ellis. Known for her fearless reporting, Serena agreed to meet at a quiet cafe. "This story has legs," Serena said after Alicia laid out the details. "If you're right, this could expose corruption on a scale we haven't seen in years, but I'll need more than speculation." "I'm working on it," Alicia replied. "When the time comes, I'll make sure you have what you need." Serena smiled, her pen poised over her notebook. "You've got my attention. Just keep me in the loop." Meanwhile, Carter and Mitchell's lives continued to unravel. Carter's anger turned to desperation as his support within the precinct eroded. "They're throwing us under the bus," he ranted to Mitchell. "We need to hit back hard." Mitchell, increasingly uneasy, shifted in his seat. "How? The evidence is everywhere, and the judge isn't backing down." Carter leaned in, his voice dropping. "Then we make him back down. Everyone has a weakness." Unaware of Carter's latest scheme, Malcolm focused on building his case. With Reed's help, he uncovered a paper trail of complaints and disciplinary actions against Carter and Mitchell that had been quietly buried by the precinct. "This is damning," Reed said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "The department knew about their behavior and covered it up." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "This is bigger than I thought. It's not just two bad cops. It's an entire system enabling them." Reed nodded grimly. "And that system will fight back." At another rally, Malcolm addressed the growing crowd with a fiery determination. "This isn't just about one case or one person. This is about justice. It's about dismantling a system that allows discrimination and abuse to thrive." The crowd roared, their voices unified in a chant, "Justice now, justice now." As Malcolm stepped off the stage, Reverend Bennett approached him. "You've got the community behind you," Bennett said, "but be careful. Those in power won't go down quietly." Carter, meanwhile, escalated his tactics. Late one evening, Malcolm's phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "Drop the case or you'll regret it." Malcolm showed the message to Alicia, who frowned deeply. "They're getting desperate," she said. "But it also means we're close to something big." Malcolm nodded. "Let them try to scare me. I've faced worse." The tipping point came when Serena published an exposé featuring anonymous accounts from former colleagues of Carter and Mitchell. The piece painted a vivid picture of systemic corruption, emboldening more whistleblowers to come forward. "Carter and Mitchell aren't just bad cops," the article read. "They're symbols of a broken system that prioritizes loyalty over accountability." The public outcry was immediate. Social media lit up with demands for justice, and local news outlets picked up the story. At the precinct, Chief Daniels called an emergency meeting. "This is a nightmare," he said, slamming a folder onto the table. "The media has the narrative now, and we're losing control." An officer raised his hand tentatively. "What about Carter and Mitchell? Should we suspend them?" Daniels hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Do it. We need to show we're taking action, even if it's just for optics." That evening, Malcolm sat in his study, reviewing the progress made so far. His phone buzzed. It was Reed. "We've got a name," Reed said. The burner phone was purchased by one of Carter's known associates, a guy named Ryan Decker. "Do we have proof linking Decker to Carter?" Malcolm asked. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Reed replied. "Decker's our key. If we can connect the dots, we'll have Carter cornered." The final blow. As the evidence against Carter and Mitchell mounted, Malcolm knew the next step was to bring their crimes to light in a way that couldn't be ignored. With Reed's latest lead on Ryan Decker, he saw an opportunity to unravel the remaining threads of their cover-up. Reed called early the next morning. "We tracked Decker to a motel on the outskirts of town. He's been lying low, but I think he's feeling the heat. If we approach carefully, we might get him to flip." Malcolm agreed. "Let's move quickly. If Carter catches wind of this, he'll try to shut Decker down." Later that day, Malcolm and Reed met with Decker in a dingy motel room, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Decker, a wiry man with darting eyes, looked uneasy as Malcolm laid out the situation. "You're in a bad spot, Decker," Malcolm began. "We have enough to tie you to the burner phone Carter used. If you cooperate, we can work with the DA to cut you a deal. But if you stay silent, you're going down with him." Decker hesitated, his hands trembling. "I didn't sign up for this." Carter said it was just a favor. "Keep things quiet, nothing big." "And now you're facing obstruction charges," Reed interjected. "But you can help yourself if you give us everything." After a tense silence, Decker finally spoke. "Okay, I'll talk." Decker's confession was the breakthrough they needed. He revealed that Carter had orchestrated a smear campaign against Malcolm, using fake witnesses and fabricated evidence to discredit him. Decker had acted as a middleman, coordinating the effort to cover Carter's tracks. "This is it," Malcolm said, his voice steady but determined. "We have the proof to expose them." The following evening, Malcolm held a press conference. The community, media, and activists packed into the venue, buzzing with anticipation. Malcolm stood at the podium, his presence commanding. "For too long, the truth has been hidden," he began, "but today we bring it to light. Officers Carter and Mitchell have not only violated their oaths, but have actively worked to undermine justice and accountability." He presented the evidence, Decker's recorded testimony, documents showing falsified reports, and internal emails exposing the precinct's complicity. "This isn't just about two officers," Malcolm continued. "It's about dismantling a system that enables corruption and protects abusers." The crowd erupted into applause, chants of "Justice now" echoing through the hall. Carter watched the press conference from his home, his face pale and drawn. Mitchell sat beside him, shaking his head. "We're done," Mitchell said quietly. "It's over." But Carter wasn't ready to concede. "No, there's still a way out. I just need time." Mitchell stood, his expression resolute. "You can keep fighting, but I'm done. I'm not going down for your mess." The fallout was swift. Carter and Mitchell were placed under arrest, and Chief Daniels announced his resignation amid the scandal. The community celebrated, their voices amplified by the media coverage. But for Malcolm, the work was far from over. He met with Alicia and Serena to discuss the next steps. "We've won this battle," Alicia said, "but the war isn't over." Malcolm nodded. "We need systemic reforms, mandatory oversight, independent investigations, and training that addresses bias." Serena smiled. "And with the momentum we've built, we have the power to demand it." Weeks later, Malcolm stood at another rally, the crowd larger and more energized than ever. "This is what change looks like," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "But we can't stop here. Together we will build a system that truly serves and protects us all." The crowd roared in agreement, their unity a testament to the power of truth and resilience. That evening, Malcolm sat with his family on the porch, the weight of the past months lifting slightly. "We did it," he said softly. Alicia smiled, her hand resting on his. "You did it, and you've shown everyone that standing up for justice is always worth it." The fight wasn't over, but Malcolm knew they had taken a monumental step forward. For now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing the future was brighter because of their efforts. The victory we built together. The days after the arrests of Carter and Mitchell marked a turning point for the community. While the fallout had shaken the city, it had also awakened a spirit of unity and determination. Malcolm knew this was the moment to cement lasting change. As the sun set on a crisp evening, Malcolm stood on a stage erected in the city's Central Park. The rally was the largest yet, with thousands gathered. Families, activists, students, and elders all united by a common cause. Signs reading, "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now" swayed in the crowd. Malcolm took a deep breath and stepped to the microphone. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady, "we celebrate not just a victory but a movement. This isn't about one person, one case, or one corrupt officer. This is about all of us, about refusing to stay silent, about demanding better, and about building a future we can all be proud of." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the city. "We've shown what can happen when we come together," Malcolm continued, "but the work doesn't stop here. True change isn't a moment, it's a movement, and it's up to all of us to carry this forward." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the crowd. "So I'm asking you, don't let this fire fade. Use your voice, share your story. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, because together we've proven that we are unstoppable." As the rally wound down, Malcolm took a moment to reflect. His phone buzzed with notifications, messages of support, donations to community initiatives, and countless people sharing their stories on social media. One particular message stood out. It was from a young black student who wrote, "Thank you for showing me that our voices matter. I used to think people like me couldn't make a difference, but now I know we can." Malcolm smiled, his chest swelling with pride. This was why he had fought so hard, not just for justice, but for hope. Back at home, Malcolm recorded a heartfelt video message addressing everyone who had followed the journey. "To everyone who stood with us, I want to say thank you," he began, his tone warm and genuine. "This fight wasn't easy, and it's far from over. But because of you, your support, your courage, your determination, we've made history." He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "If this story has inspired you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments how you're standing up for justice in your own community." Malcolm smiled softly. And if you're not already part of this growing movement, subscribe now and join us. Together we're changing the world, one voice, one story, one step at a time. He ended the recording, confident that his words would resonate far beyond his city. The final scene of the video was Malcolm walking through the park, now quiet under the evening sky. A small group of kids played basketball nearby, their laughter ringing out in the stillness. As he watched them, a sense of peace washed over him. The screen faded to black, but Malcolm's voice lingered. This isn't just my story, it's ours. Let's write the next chapter together. To those who made it to the end of this story, thank you. Your engagement fuels change. If you believe in the power of truth and resilience, give this video a like. Share it with your friends and family. It could inspire them too. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're from or how this story resonated with you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. Together we can keep pushing for a brighter, fairer future. Let's make it happen.